The room fell silent the moment he entered. It wasn't the kind of silence one expects from a quiet room or a paused conversation. It was the kind of silence that settled deep in your bones, the kind that made your heart race and your throat tighten without explanation. The very air seemed to bend to him. Evan had never spoken a word, but people trembled when he was around. No one understood why. They didn't know where he came from, but they knew one thing for certain. He was not someone to cross. The mere sight of him in a room was enough to send shivers down the spine of even the bravest. And that's exactly how he liked it. In a world where power was often measured by the loudest voice, the sharpest retort, or the most aggressive move, Evan had discovered something far more effective. He had learned that the loudest people were often the most desperate. The ones who needed to be heard were the ones who feared silence. The ones who needed control were the ones who feared the unknown. And Evan had mastered the art of silence, of presence. It wasn't a gift, though. It wasn't something that came naturally. It had taken years of careful observation, of silent manipulation, of shaping his persona in such a way that simply being near him was enough to make even the strongest bow their heads. Evan had studied the art of fear, not just how to inflict it, but how to make it an invisible force, a shadow that crept along with him wherever he went. He had watched his enemies over the years, those who thrived on control, who believed they could bend the world to their will with words, with threats, with gestures. They were always so sure of themselves. They were always so loud. And yet, in the moments when they crossed him, when they pushed him too far, they quickly learned that there was a different kind of power in the world, a power that didn't need to announce itself, and Evan had become that power. The first time he realized his ability, it wasn't something grand or extraordinary. It wasn't a calculated move or a masterstroke of strategy. No, it was a moment of pure instinct. He had been walking into a meeting, a room filled with colleagues who thought they were in control of everything, the loudest voices in the room. As he walked in, they didn't stop talking, but something shifted. Their words slowed. Their bodies stiffened. They didn't acknowledge him. They didn't need to. It was the atmosphere that changed. It was as if the air itself had changed its composition, becoming thicker, denser, darker. Evan didn't say anything. He didn't even need to make eye contact. He simply walked to his seat and sat down. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, one that felt on the verge of snapping. He didn't feel the need to assert himself. He didn't need to tell them to be quiet. The absence of noise was more powerful than any command could ever be. And for the first time, Evan saw it in their eyes. The fear. Not the kind of fear you would find in a cornered animal, frantic and desperate. This fear was something colder. This fear was rooted in uncertainty, in the awareness that there was something in the room far more dangerous than they could comprehend. And that was when Evan realized his potential, the power of presence. But what he didn't understand yet, what he couldn't have known, was just how deeply that presence would affect the people around him. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. Whispered voices, hushed tones, faces dropping in mid-conversation when he entered a room. Evan's reputation began to grow. His silence became his weapon, his ghostly presence, both unsettling and magnetic. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to threaten anyone. His presence alone was enough to bring even the most hardened individuals to their knees. But power, as anyone with any experience knows, can be dangerous. There were those who decided that Evan was too much of a threat to ignore. They sought to challenge him, to break his control, to make him speak, to make him show some sign of vulnerability. But they had no idea what they were up against. Evan had never shown weakness. He had never revealed his cards, never allowed anyone to see the cracks beneath his calm exterior. He had studied the fear of others, understood how it worked, and how to wield it like a blade. What most people didn't realize was that Evan was not trying to instill fear. He wasn't trying to dominate others. That wasn't his goal. He was simply playing a much deeper game. You see, Evan understood something most people didn't. Fear wasn't just a response. It was a state of being. And once you made someone fear you, once you took away their sense of control and security, you didn't need to say a word. They would give you everything they had without you even asking. It was subtle, but it was effective. And it was the foundation of his power. The people who came after him, those who tried to engage him, who tried to crack the stone that was Evan, didn't stand a chance. They underestimated the true extent of his control. One by one, they fell. And with each fall, the legend of Evan grew. His enemies whispered his name with a kind of reverence that bordered on terror. And still, he said nothing. He didn't need to. He had already won. As Evan's presence grew, so did the fear that followed him. It was almost palpable, hanging in the air like smoke, lingering long after he had left the room. People didn't just avoid him. They actively feared him. They spoke of him in hushed tones, as if even mentioning his name could provoke his wrath. But no one dared approach him directly. They knew better. No one could understand why they felt this way. It wasn't logical. It wasn't rational. But it was real. Evan had mastered the art of manipulating fear itself, and it was as if the universe conspired to make him an instrument of chaos. It started with subtle things. People began avoiding him at work, giving him wide berths when he walked into a room. Colleagues would freeze mid-conversation when they saw him approaching, as if their words had been stolen from their mouths. Eyes would dart nervously, and hands would fidget, but no one dared speak a word to him. The first time someone tried to break the silence, they paid the price. It was a man named Dominic, a self-assured, ambitious executive who had heard the rumors and thought they were nothing more than stories for the weak. Dominic believed he could best anyone with a strong will and a loud voice. He had spent years dominating every room he entered. So, when he heard of Evan's influence, he decided to test it. One morning, in a high-profile meeting, Dominic took his usual seat at the head of the table. He noticed Evan walk in late, as he always did, moving with the same eerie calm that had earned him such a terrifying reputation. Dominic, leaning back in his chair with a smirk, watched Evan. The room, as always, stilled when Evan entered. But Dominic wasn't intimidated. In fact, he was eager to challenge the so-called power that had the room on edge. "Evan," he said loudly, his voice echoing across the room, "we need your input on this project. You've been sitting back long enough. Don't you think it's time to speak up?" The room went dead silent. Everyone turned to look at Evan, waiting for his response. But Evan didn't speak. Instead, he did what he always did. He simply looked at Dominic. His gaze was sharp, unblinking, a piercing stare that seemed to reach deep into the very core of Dominic's soul. It wasn't just a glance. It was as if Evan was dissecting him, reading him like an open book, and it terrified Dominic. For the first time, Dominic felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness, an alien sensation that he wasn't used to. He could feel the power radiating from Evan, not in words, but in the stillness of the room, in the thick, suffocating air around him. The others were watching, waiting. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. It was as if time itself had stopped. And in that moment, Evan's silent presence was a storm that could consume everything in its path. Dominic cleared his throat nervously and shifted in his seat, trying to regain some semblance of control. But it was too late. The weight of Evan's gaze was too much. It was like a crushing force on his chest, something heavy and oppressive, something that made it impossible to think straight. The silence stretched on. No one spoke, not a single word. And then Dominic did the unthinkable. His voice cracked, his confidence shattered, and without saying another word, he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room gasped in unison. Dominic, who had never once backed down from anyone, who had ruled rooms with his charisma and confidence, was now visibly trembling. His face had drained of color, his hands shaking as he hurriedly left the room. The meeting continued as if nothing had happened, but everyone knew exactly what they had witnessed. No one questioned Evan's power anymore. It wasn't long before the whispers spread like wildfire. People no longer just avoided Evan. They actively feared his presence. The room went cold when he entered, and even the most hardened individuals couldn't ignore the weight of his gaze. They didn't understand why it affected them the way it did. There was no physical threat. No word had been spoken, but it was as if Evan carried a force far greater than any weapon, something intangible, yet real. But the most chilling part of Evan's power wasn't just the fear it instilled in others. It was the fact that the fear was unspoken, unknowable. It wasn't something that could be measured. It wasn't something anyone could challenge. He had found a way to make everyone feel small without raising a finger, and it was working. As Evan's influence grew, so did the people who sought him out. They came to him for one reason: power. They knew that if they could make themselves an ally of Evan, if they could somehow bend the silence to their favor, they would control everything. But Evan wasn't interested in allies. He was interested in control. Complete control. The kind of control that left no room for compromise, no room for weakness. And so, those who came to him seeking power found themselves caught in a web of manipulation they couldn't escape. It wasn't the kind of manipulation that involved threats or promises. It wasn't the kind of manipulation that needed words. It was a far more subtle art, one that had taken Evan years to master. Every meeting, every encounter with Evan was like a test of whether someone could withstand the silence, withstand the weight of his gaze. Those who couldn't were quickly discarded. But there was something more insidious at play. The longer people stayed in Evan's presence, the more they began to question themselves. They started second-guessing their every move, their every word. They became unsure of their own power, uncertain of their place in the world. The confidence they once carried began to erode, slowly, quietly, until they were nothing but shadows of their former selves. And that was exactly how Evan wanted it. In a world where people believed power came from speech, from force, from dominance, Evan had learned the most effective truth. True power didn't need to speak. It simply needed to be. And the more it simply was, the more people fell under its spell. As Evan's influence expanded beyond the office and into every facet of the lives of those around him, something more dangerous began to surface. It wasn't enough for Evan to rule by silence alone. As the fear around him grew, so did the consequences for those who dared defy or question him. What had once been subtle intimidation turned into something far more lethal. There was no longer a question of whether people feared him. There was now a tangible, visceral terror that followed his every step. And it wasn't just the weak who bowed to his power. Even the strongest of minds, the most resolute individuals, began to buckle under the weight of his presence. One person who refused to bend was Rachel, an ambitious woman who had been one of Evan's closest rivals at the firm. She was sharp, confident, and determined to break through any barriers that stood in her way. When she first encountered Evan, she didn't understand the fear that surrounded him. To her, he was just another man who had learned to manipulate others with charm. She saw no threat in him, only opportunity. But Rachel didn't realize how dangerous it was to challenge a force like Evan's. It all began one evening at an exclusive corporate event. Evan stood alone, as he always did, in the corner of the room, his piercing gaze taking in everything and everyone. The crowd seemed to instinctively part around him, keeping their distance, their conversations taking on a nervous edge the moment he came into view. Rachel, on the other hand, saw only an opportunity. She had been biding her time, waiting for the right moment to take Evan down, to prove that he wasn't the unstoppable force people made him out to be. She had heard the whispers, seen the way people avoided him, and she knew that no one had ever dared challenge him openly. It was her time to change that. With her drink in hand, she walked over to him. The chatter in the room seemed to dull as she approached, the eyes of the crowd silently tracking her every movement. But Rachel felt no fear. In fact, she felt more powerful than ever, knowing she was about to confront the source of everyone's fear. "Evan," she said with a smile that was both confident and taunting, "I've heard a lot about you, but I'm not one to believe in ghost stories. I think it's time someone taught you a lesson about real power." Her words sliced through the stillness of the room. For a moment, there was no sound. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Rachel could see the eyes of the onlookers widen, and she felt a brief surge of triumph. They were watching, waiting to see if she could do what no one else had. Evan didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned his head to look at her. His gaze was cold and unblinking, a stark contrast to the warm light of the room. Rachel stood tall, refusing to let the silence unnerve her, but she felt a strange shift in the air, a sudden, uncomfortable pressure that made her skin crawl. She shook it off. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" she pressed, leaning in just slightly. "But you're just like everyone else, weak, afraid, hiding behind that silence of yours." For a moment, it seemed as though Evan wasn't even listening. His face remained emotionless, unreadable. But Rachel's words had started to dig into him, hadn't they? She could feel it in her gut. He was rattled. But then, something changed. Evan took a single step toward her, his body moving with an unnerving calmness. The crowd seemed to part as he walked, as if afraid to even brush against him. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She had expected him to say something, to retaliate in some way. But instead, he only walked closer, closer than she ever imagined. And that was when it happened. His gaze met hers, But this time, there was no coldness, no silence. There was a presence, a force, a weight that seemed to press in on her from all directions. She couldn't breathe. Her throat tightened, her chest constricted, and for the first time, she felt a chill run down her spine. The room had grown still, the air heavy, suffocating. The world around her seemed to blur. The pressure intensified, tightening, until she couldn't focus. She couldn't think. Evan's voice was low, but it cut through the stillness like a knife. You don't understand, do you? You think power is something you take, something you speak into existence, but it's not. Real power is something you feel, something you can't escape. It's the silence that drowns you, that makes you question your own existence. Rachel tried to speak, but no words came out. The room spun around her, and she felt the world slipping away. Her body trembled as if under an immense weight. The others in the room watched with wide eyes, but no one moved. No one dared to intervene. Evan was controlling everything, and they were all just helpless observers. The pressure in Rachel's chest finally became too much, and she collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, her hands clutching at the floor for stability. Her mind was racing, but there were no thoughts, only the crushing sensation of Evan's presence, the understanding that she had underestimated him. She had believed that power was something that could be taken, something that could be earned. But Evan had shown her something else, a power that didn't need to be earned, a power that only needed to be felt. And in that moment, Rachel understood. She understood that Evan was not just a man. He was an idea, an embodiment of something far greater than any individual could comprehend. As Evan turned and walked away, leaving her on the floor gasping for breath, the crowd parted to let him pass, their eyes lowered in fear, in awe, in respect. Evan didn't need to utter a word. His presence was enough. From that night forward, Rachel was never the same. Her confidence shattered, her ambitions clouded by doubt. She couldn't escape the haunting feeling of Evan's gaze, of the power he had shown her in the silence of that room. And as for Evan, he only continued to grow in influence. People, both rivals and allies, began to recognize the truth. They didn't need to fear his words. They needed to fear him, his silence, his presence, his control. It was enough to break anyone. There would be no speeches, no grand proclamations, just the silence. And in the end, it was that silence that would be the most terrifying weapon of all.